Communicators, a discussion on technology and telecommunications policy with Representative Greg Walden, Chairman of the House Subcommittee on Communications.
Chairman Greg Walden, if you could start our communicators this week by telling us what is your legislative agenda for the 112th Congress?
Well, we have a number of issues that we're going to take up in this session of Congress on the Communications and Telecommunications Subcommittee. First of all, we started with a review of what the Federal Communications Commission has done on net neutrality. Obviously, our side believes they didn't have the authority, and we've been through the hearings, and I'm sure we can get into that in detail later in the program. Second is looking at FCC process and reform. Chairman Janikowski has put in some reforms, and I'm not picking on this commission. I think over time, there are issues that have come to the fore. There are processes that have people have had some criticism about how rulemakings move forward at the commission. And surprising commissioners and big changes late at night, kind of what Congress was doing for a while. And as former chairman of the GOP transition, we tried to change that in our rules. The fact that no two commissioners can talk to each other about a policy issue is an issue they've raised with us, and their members of both sides say maybe that's something we ought to look at so they can actually talk to each other. And then, of course, there are issues related to the Universal Service Fund. And as you know, the Federal Communications Commission is working on some proposals there on universal service reform, intercarrier compensation, all of those very technical issues. And we've got members of our subcommittee that have an interest in that. Spectrum, who has it, who's using it, who's sitting on it, what are the needs, what's the value, how do we address the public safety need in a way that we can afford. Broadband, where are we at the rollout? $7 billion was spent in the stimulus, or at least obligated. It's all out the door, but it isn't all spent. I want to make sure we're getting our money's worth. Whoever's putting it at the ground, are we getting the fiber, or are we getting the throughputs when it is connected? Who's doing the oversight and evaluation there? And there'll be a host of other issues, I'm sure, as we go forward.
Well, if we could start with the net neutrality issue this week, your committee voted 15-8 to overturn the FCC's rulemaking on net neutrality. You used the Congressional Review Act in overturning this. What was the purpose of that?
You know, twofold. One, this is a very specific law that was passed in a bipartisan manner. Senator Reid in the Senate helped get it through back, I think it was in '95, to just address regulations that have big consequences that the Congress says, wait a minute, we don't agree with you. And so the advantage, frankly, for those of us who seek to overturn this government regulation of the internet is that using the Congressional Review Act means that it can be brought up in the Senate. It is a privileged motion. It is, if there are 40 senators that sign it, it has to come to the floor, and it's not subject to the filibuster. So if you're where I'm sitting and want to do something about repealing a rule, there is a shot clock that starts at 60 days. It's a complicated way to count the 60 days prescribed in statute, but it gives you a real opportunity to move an issue forward and not get it roadblocked in the Senate on a filibuster threat.
I'm going to read you two quotes and get your response. These are from your colleagues on the Democratic side of your subcommittee, or the committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee. Henry Waxman, quote, regarding this week's net neutrality hearing: Republicans couldn't get a single major broadband provider to testify in support of their resolution. And Anna Eshoo, who is a ranking member on your subcommittee, to upset the apple cart would be fooling around with something we shouldn't be fooling around with.
Okay, so you want me to take Chairman Waxman's comments first, probably. Look, when it comes to the chairman's comments, you're in a situation. I was a licensee broadcast owner for 22 years. My regulator's the Federal Communications Commission. If the commission came to me and said, either do this bad thing or this less bad thing, you're probably going to try and work out the less bad thing. And I think that's what you would find if you parse through the statements from AT&T and others, that they felt like they were in a box. They have their regulator, they got other deals pending, they got other issues before the commission. The commission says, we think we have this authority. We're either going to do Title I, light regulation, or, oh, by the way, we've got this Title II proceeding open where we may treat you as a common carrier and really come down on you. Club hanging up here. What are you going to do? You're going to reach an agreement for the lightest regulation possible. And once you've reached that agreement, these are honorable people. Say, I cut my deal. I'm sorry, I can't come in and testify against this. But you know what? At the end of the day, I don't work for AT&T and I don't work for Verizon or any of those companies. I'm trying to do what's best for public policy. So ironically, AT&T was the Democrats' witness at this hearing. And so, and the cable folks, they're saying, hey, we cut our deal. We can't come in and go against it. Did we want to be there? Do we think it's necessary? Do we go back and read through the testimony from AT&T, and you find the words that sort of say, we didn't ask for this, we don't think it's needed, but we got to live with it because we agreed to it. Okay. Meanwhile, the FCC still keeps open this Title II proceeding, right? So that if they lose the court case, it's pretty obvious to me there's a GPS locator that says go over here to Title II and we'll regulate the internet as a common carrier using Title II. We've already got the proceeding open to go down that path. Otherwise, why wouldn't they close the proceeding? So that's from that perspective. Hard to get somebody that's reached their deal back in December because they had a big club over their head. I could say the FCC is engaged in rather bullying tactics, if you will, with some of these mergers and all. We're seeing voluntary side agreements that they're never going to speak publicly about the pressure they're under, but they got a regulator they've got to deal with. As far as Ms. Eshu's comments, look, we just disagree. The FCC, in my opinion, is picking winners and losers on the internet. If you're the provider of the flow, you're now regulated by the government. If you're a writer on the pipe, you're not. So and I'm not picking on Netflix. I'm actually a subscriber. I'm not picking on Google. They actually have a data center in my district, 20 miles from where I live, and they're great companies. But we're trying to look at this from a policy standpoint. We had an economist testify, Dr. Kovacs, and she advises financial world. Do you invest in these companies or not? And she's basically saying, look, you can get to the point where the provider of the backbone is having to increase their capacity and not get a rate of return on it from those using it, who, by the way, dramatically are increasing their usage. So at some point, the demand on that is not connected up with a payment structure. And so you could do harm to the internet going forward if we don't get it right. And so, I mean, these are issues that I think we need to continue to look at.
Joining us in our conversation with Chairman Greg Walden of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology is Mike Zappler, technology reporter with the Politico.
When you talk to independent experts about this net neutrality issue, almost universally you hear that the likelihood of Congress actually succeeding in overturning these rules is practically nil. The president would never sign it. Why is the committee spending so much time on this when there are these other major issues like broadband deployment, the looming spectrum crunch? It has the feel of kind of an ideological pursuit instead of dealing with the serious issues.
And Mike, I know that's one of the arguments the Democrats made on the committee. The irony of that argument is we would have had this markup done last week, but for the fact they said, oh, wait a minute, we need to have a hearing on this. So I canceled the markup, postponed it, and we said, okay, instead of, we were going to do spectrum, and said, well, okay, we'll go spend more time on this because the Democrats asked us to. So we created another panel. They got half the witnesses, probably unprecedented in Energy and Commerce. At the end of 2 hearings, the Democrats had more witnesses in the minority than we had in the majority. I didn't have any, let's debate the issue. It's a big issue. I don't mind spending the time on it. And they didn't mind spending the time discussing it because they asked for a second hearing. And so that's just chatter. We have plenty of time to get after these other issues, and we intend to. We're going to run a very aggressive set of hearings and going to move forward because these are big issues. As I said, I was a broadcaster for 22 years, one of 2 licensed amateur radio operators in the Congress. I know a little bit about spectrum. I know a little bit about telecommunications, and I intend to run a pretty active committee and subcommittee.
What about the likelihood or almost certainty that the president's never going to sign this? Why spend all this time on this issue when
I don't think
it's going to be settled in the courts almost certainly?
It may well be settled in the courts. We're building a legislative record, and just because we don't live in a dictatorship, so the president doesn't get to just tell the House what it's going to do or not do. I don't believe in that. We're responding. We were the last plebiscite across the country, right? Every House member's up for election. The public spoke pretty clearly. There was, by the way, I think 70 or 80 members, candidates, who signed up on the net neutrality card, and I think virtually every one of them lost. Not that that was the deciding issue. I'm not going to make that case, but it's intriguing. So I actually think it's an issue the public cares about, and we have an obligation to pursue. And as I say, I don't work for AT&T or Verizon or Google or anybody. I just think as a matter of public policy, we've had an open and vibrant internet absent government regulation. This is, even though it's a lighter touch regulation than Title II, this you have to admit is the FCC starting to regulate the internet. And if they fail in court, as they have before in the BitTorrent Comcast case, they may come back and think they'll reclassify it under Title II. And I still think under Section 706, they potentially open the door for state regulation by doing this, because they balance part of their authority on Section 706 sub 2, which 706 sub 1 says, oh, by the way, just like you, FCC, state regulators have the authority to regulate in these areas if you have the authority. And there are some state regulators that might go, huh, you mean I can start regulating the internet in Vermont or New York, or I don't know where they are. But do we want to go down that path? I think there are some IEDs out there that I think it's important to at least have the discussion and get people thinking that it's more than just some light touch regulation that should go because those affected got put in a corner and said, we're okay with it. So that's my story.
You mentioned Chairman Walden's spectrum as one of the
Yes,
issues that you'll be looking at. Last week on the Communicators, NAB Chair, our President Gordon Smith, called for an inventory of all the available spectrum. Do you agree with that? And is this a fight between the broadcasters and the cell phone operators?
Oh, well, that's a good question. And I'm glad you had Gordon Smith on. He's a constituent of mine. I represent his hometown in Oregon, and we're good friends. I would say this. I think it's important to do the inventory, which is more than just identifying on a chart who has what spectrum. I think you have to go deeper than that and look at who has it, who's using it, who's sitting on it, how much is out there. And that's both private and public, which gets a little difficult on the defense side and all. But really, I think spectrum is an enormously valuable asset that the citizens have. And it's our job to manage it appropriately. And there are lots of demands for it. There are enormous commercial demands. And you want to talk about unleashing innovation and new technology and jobs. Look at what's happened in the cell world. We could all pull out our devices if they didn't interfere with the microphones. They'd be in this room. You look at what's happened, and you look at how the prices have gone down, and the technology's gone out, and there's lots of opportunity when there's spectrum available. So that's a piece of this. What do you do with the D block? We're coming up on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Public safety still very clearly says we need more spectrum. I'd like to know how they've used the 100 megahertz that they have, what they really need. There have been some waivers granted so that police and fire could build out in, I think, New York and Washington and a few of the larger cities, as long as it can eventually be interoperable, which is a goal we share. But as the president now says, give the D block to public safety at no charge, runs in conflict with the broadband plan that said, and the law which says you're going to auction it. That's a $3 billion issue. At least that's the value originally assigned to the D block. So you have a budgetary issue, and then you have these other blocks of spectrum that we need to look at. At the end of the day, it's an issue we just got to get into, and we will, I assure you, we will in the committee.
I have a question about basic research funding. The Republicans are proposing fairly deep cuts to these areas. President Obama says that's the exact opposite way that we need to go to compete with China and other global competitors. I'm curious, as a top Republican voice in Congress, what's your take on this issue and the Republican cuts specifically?
Sure. So here's the problem that we face. First of all, you have to step back, because nobody in 12 years ever come through my door and said, cut my spending. They may say cut yours, but they never say cut their own. We have to be able to prioritize what it is that this country needs to move forward and create jobs and innovate and all that. I actually am a fan of research. I've supported NIH research. I've supported investments in new technologies through some of the energy bills and all, and I think it's important. We have to look in the context of where's the money coming from and where's it going and what are we getting for it, and do that as we did when we reauthorized NIH and reorganized it a bit to say how do we maximize and create better communication and partnerships. And so without getting into the specifics, because frankly I don't know the dollar for dollar what he's proposing versus what we're proposing, The second piece of this, though, is remember that in the last Congress, no budget was passed, first time since the Budget Act in 1974, that the House did not vote on a budget. House and Senate haven't always agreed, got that, but we didn't vote on one. And the continuing resolution got us to March 4th, but didn't fund the full fiscal year. Now, that's not the first time that's happened either. It's just a bad way to govern. And so we're having to try and figure out how to, in a year of a record deficit again, I think 29 months in a row set a record for monthly deficits for the country. 223 billion last month alone, I think, in February. We're arguing over cutting 61 billion out of a $1.6 trillion deficit this year. So we're going to have
Are those cuts a good idea, though? Specifically the science and research. I mean, do you agree or disagree?
I would say that I haven't gotten into the specific level implications.
The general direction, though.
Well, here's the problem. You're borrowing 40 cents on every dollar. You got to cut somewhere. I would prefer not to cut science? Sure. I mean, I would prefer not to cut research? Sure. But I was a small business owner for 22 years. I couldn't have survived borrowing 40 cents on every dollar I spent. So some things are going to have to be reprioritized. And that's where I hope we can figure out, if you do what the president's proposing on D block and the other spectrum and repacking and all, rather than have that money available for other, you cut a very big new hole we're going to have to figure out. So another $3 billion you got to go find. Those are big numbers.
Right.
Big numbers.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guest this week is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology in the House, Representative Greg Walden, a Republican of Oregon. Guest reporter Mike Zappler of Politico. Mr. Zappler, next question.
I have a question of just following up on the net neutrality debate, and
Sure.
a lot of the tech and telecom issues historically have been nonpartisan. There's been a lot of partisan sniping so far in the committee over net neutrality. I'm wondering, what do you think will be the first bipartisan accomplishment of your subcommittee?
Oh, I think we can find bipartisanship on process reform at the FCC. And as you and I have talked, she's dropped a bill that's already bipartisan on the sunshine piece I alluded to earlier. I think we can do more than that. We talked during the discussion yesterday when other people were talking. Nan and I had a little side conversation about potentially working together on some broader reforms. I think on spectrum, we should be able to find some common ground. I think we'd probably find some common ground principles on USF. Now, that may, in the end, be something the FCC handles, although we have legislation that we're working on. But I think there's a lot on the tech side. This one, let's face it, this one's the controversial piece. This is the one that you got people on one side and people on the other. I got that. We didn't ask for this fight. In fact, 300 members of Congress said, don't do it. Now, part of those were don't do Title II,
Right.
do net neutrality, don't do. But there were a lot of people that told the FCC at the end of last year, don't. We want to operate in this sphere. And they said, no, we're going ahead. Even after the election, which should have been some indicators things had changed.
Chairman Walden, what would you like to see the FCC do when it comes to USF reform?
Well, I think there are several principles that I think. First of all, I think you could find some common ground that the fund's gotten too big, $8.8 billion and growing. There are things in some of the Lifeline link-up that they've addressed that are problems that's going to explode costs over here. I think as a sort of guiding principle, and remember I represent a district that's 70,000 square miles larger than any state this side of the Mississippi. I've got county that there's one person for every 9 miles of power line. Okay, so USF matters in a district like mine, matters a lot. What I want to make sure though is that there's that it's properly constructed and reformed, so that the money that is there and is essential for service goes to those areas that without that support, wouldn't survive. So we can't be taken away from them. If we can get various reforms in place, and we won't get into all those today, but we're working on those, then maybe there's an opportunity to work on some broadband as well, because I want to make sure we got broadband deployment out into the last mile, the hardest to get to, the very rural areas. And so I think there are lots of issues there to deal with, and we're trying to work.
Rural-urban issue?
Well, you've got some urban issues, you've got sort of the donut in the hole, and we want to make sure that the money's going outside, not inside. You don't need multiple carriers in the same market getting subsidy. There are people have come to me. I was in a meeting yesterday in a state I'll leave unnamed. You got third or fourth wireless carrier getting USF in the same market. Really? Why, that's not what it's for. So I think there's room to evaluate and say, who's getting it now? Do they really need it? And, because there, as you know, or both of you know, there are members of Congress who want to do away with it altogether. See it as a cross subsidy that shouldn't be there. It's 15.5% of your phone bill. I mean, there are people that say, why? Why am I subsidizing your folks out there in wherever Oregon? And yet we have a policy nationally, as we've had with energy, we've had it with telecommunications, to say nobody's going to be left off.
A question about online privacy. There's an idea that's kind of gaining some traction to force web browsers to include a do not track function, so people surfing the web wouldn't have their activities monitored, essentially.
Right.
What's your take on that, and how do you balance the concern and the need for online privacy with the concern that a strict regime could hurt e-commerce, which is booming right now?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting one, and there are clearly arguments on both sides of that one. As a consumer, I think I want to have control of that, and I think most users would want to have that. They make the decision. Then if I'm going to some websites that I do want to track me because I want to go back and I don't, they've got my information, I can order whatever and do whatever, it all works. But I think at the end of the day, the Internet's great vitality has been driven by consumers, by individuals having control. And I think they value their privacy. And this is an area we need to take a look at, but I think the market has generally stepped up. There are already browsers that you can check and say, private browsing. I don't want you tracking me everywhere. It's nobody. I don't know who it is, but I don't want you. And I think there is that sense. Other people are fine with that. I go to a sporting goods site or something, and there are others that then know I'm there and they have offers or cooking or whatever. Some people may be just fine with that.
Do you think Congress needs to move on this front?
I'm not convinced we have to jump into it right now. I'm not. See, I'm the kind of guy that believes in the marketplace as long as the marketplace can function. And that if you haven't demonstrated that there's some power harm analysis, going on where the marketplace doesn't work, then there's maybe a role for government to step in. But absent that, let's look, when some internet provider, whatever, does something, that the internet community rises up pretty quickly and slaps them down. It's pretty effective.
Are you satisfied with the current federal laws protecting people's privacy, except in the case, of course, of criminal activity or anything like that?
Generally speaking, but again, it's an area that I think you have your cybersecurity issues, and the speaker has asked Mac Thornberry to kind of lead a task force, and there are a couple of us that will be involved in that. So we'll be looking at all of that.
Any thoughts about the cuts that Republicans are proposing to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? Your take on that as
my own state a number of years ago stopped subsidizing public broadcasting. Look, I used to be in the public broadcasting caucus. I'm not in as many of those as I used to be. I mean, I kind of got carried away. But as a broadcaster and former president of the Oregon Association of Broadcasters, and I've worked in partnership with our public broadcasters, I think there's a role. The issue now, though, is how much of these sorts of things can we afford when we're borrowing 40 cents on the dollar? And I think any organization, this is not the time, by the way, to be captured on video saying something that antagonizes a whole element of either party. And I think that, there have just been some of these things that throw up red flags. And I think beyond that, and I've talked to my broadcast friends in Oregon that are in public broadcasting, they don't want to lose their CPP funding.
You wouldn't favor that as it stands now?
Well, I voted for the resolution that went across that had it in it.
Okay.
And I think the recent disclosure on NPR, they're trying to address it. I've met with Pat Butler, who's head of the TV affiliates. He's a friend. We've tried to talk through some of these things, and I think there's a role for public broadcasting. The question is, how much should taxpayers support? And if there is this attitude sort of inside the organization that would appear to be as partisan as what's come out, there's going to be a consequence. This is a reality. It's political. You're getting taxpayer money. And the taxpayers are going, are we really funding that? And my money's funding, hard to defend.
Did you receive, as a radio broadcaster, did you ever receive any CPP money?
No, I was commercial.
You were commercial.
Oh yeah, no, we owned and
What kind of
operated
radio?
five.
What kind of radio stations
We
were
had
there?
we had 2 AMs and 3 AFMs, commercial. All of them were commercial, so no, I didn't get any government. So
Talk radio,
we
music.
had, oh yeah, we had oldies, we had hot AC, we had country, we had classic rock, and our. But it was actually, we won a Marconi Award for our AM station, and it's a community service, which is the highest award the broadcasters give out. A number of years ago, great team. We a lot of local sports, local news. Really focused, I think, on what makes broadcasting successful, and is when you focus on the local community's needs.
So when it comes to radio issues, there's a music Bill of Rights or a music issue out there about playing music on the radio. As a former radio station owner and chairman of the Internet subcommittee, what's your take on that?
You know, I've actually been with the broadcasters on that issue, on the music royalty issue.
Right.
You know, maybe they can work all this out. And again, I'd like to see if those two industries, they're a little at war occasionally, could work it out. Look, you've got a lot of small broadcasters out there that $1,000 a month or $1,000 a year or $5,000 a year is going to make a difference. I mean, you get out in my district, these are mom and pop stations where you're the good thing about small business, you set your own hours, all 24 of them. And my wife and I have done all 24. The transmitter site, replacing a foot of snow, replacing a transmission line overnight, at the tower base that burned out with an engineer. I mean, I've done it all. This stuff is hard work. And you add an extra royalty fee on top and something else here, and you're already paying ASCAP and PMI. And now I realize that's the different group. But somewhere in there, you'd hope kind of the music industry could figure out how to compensate each other.
Chairman Walden, recently the NIH came out with a study on cell phone safety, which showed that there was increased brain activity, is essentially what their study said. Is that an issue that your subcommittee will be addressing at all?
It's not come up on the radar. Nobody's come to us and said, better take a look at that. I think too now, a lot of us have gone to these little earpiece devices that you plug in, and so you're not holding the transmitter, which is the issue I would assume they're addressing, although there's a little Bluetooth here, but it can't be that much power. You're not holding that antenna and transmitter right against your head, but it's not an issue that's come up.
What's the number one thing that your subcommittee can do to promote job creation? What's the number one item on your
Repeal the net neutrality rules. Look,
How does that create jobs?
Yeah, well, I think, look, I think spectrum allocation, getting it out there into the market. The more of it that can be out there in a commercial environment where the innovators can take it and go. We talked earlier about cuts in research or not doing enough. The private sector is really where probably multiples get done in terms of research and development budgets. We support it through R&D tax credits, all those sorts of things. And I think, you've got your recorder here, and we've all got our devices here and there, and then government's had a very small role in the development of any of those. But when there's somebody has a bright idea and they can take it and run with it, and there's a spectrum to use. Now, so I think spectrum probably is the biggest thing we can do.
Is it helpful to you to have Anna Eshoo as your ranking member who represents Silicon Valley?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, she's in deep with those companies and has a long and very solid experience on the committee. So absolutely, I called her the day she was picked. We got together in my office and we've had some good chats.
Mike Zappler, final question.
I have a question about a tax issue. The tech industry and other industries are about to push for a repatriation holiday on profits overseas that they bring back. There's about $1 trillion sitting overseas. They say that's money that could be used to stimulate the economy, but when you look at what happened last time, by and large it went to shareholders, dividend payouts. What's your take on the repatriation holiday?
I think it's good. I don't think it ought to be just a holiday. I think we need to look broader than a one-time deal. And that's the tax code over. We need to be more competitive. I met with Stephen Ballmer, head of Microsoft, when he was in town when the president of China was here. And he talked about those issues and stranded revenues offshore, and you got to make a decision to expand somewhere. Do you do it where the money is, or do you pay a penalty of 20, whatever the tax rate is, to bring it back here and expand here? It's hard to go to your shareholders, who you're obligated to take care of, and say, actually, I'm going to take that 20% or 25% hit and bring the money here and build, when I can do it for 25% less somewhere else. So I think all that matters. And even though I concur that maybe it didn't, studies show it didn't quite go into reinvestment, but let's face it, it went out to shareholders. Somebody's paying capital gains tax on that, comes back to the government, and by the way, that's money in the marketplace, which is better than having it offshore somewhere and used offshore. I'd rather have it here in the form of dividends to shareholders or investment in company or something than held offshore and never used back in America.
Congressman Greg Walden is chairman of the Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Mike Zappler with the Politico. Thank you both.
Thank you.